Welcome to the Ozone. I'm Robin Trimingham of the Olderhood Group, and my guest today is Adam Harrison, who is a medical leadership coach from the UK. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, Robin. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Today, our topic is pivoting your leadership style as a result of the pandemic. Something that I think you have been highly involved in, helping physicians and hospitals with their work. So start us off. Can you tell us briefly what it's been like for leaders inside the medical profession in recent months? I mean, we all know it must have been incredibly difficult, but what's it like on the other side of the fence?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So as you know, as a physician and leadership coach, I work with a lot of senior doctors who share their stories with me. And honestly, Robin, it's been really challenging. Prior to the pandemic, medical leadership roles were already really stressful. Certainly here in the UK, there have been ongoing issues for years now with funding deficits, ever increasing patient demand, difficulties around medical staff recruitment and retention, to name just a few. But I think the pandemic has magnified all those issues, both the systemic ones like the funding I mentioned, but also the anxieties arising out of the fear of the coronavirus itself, have exacerbated people's own personal stresses and anxieties, feelings of overwhelm, levels of burnout. And obviously this has negatively impacted on their performance at work and their relationships with colleagues. I also just want to kind of point out really that leaders are usually employees themselves with line managers of their own. And they too have been on the receiving end of conduct by their own stressed managers that is at best, I suppose, unintentionally unkind, but at worst has been deliberately toxic.
I can appreciate that it must be incredibly hard as a leader if you are feeling incredibly stressed and almost fearful in some respects to separate and settle that part of yourself. But what are the consequences of being a toxic leader in this kind of an industry?
I think they're kind of several fold. If I can break it down into effects on the organization itself, then on team members, and then finally consequences for patients. So firstly, we know from a 2013 study on incivility by Porath and Pearson that when on the receiving end of rudeness, disrespect, and outright hostility at work, 48% of employees decreased their work effort, 78% said their commitment to the organization declines, and 25% admit to taking out their frustration on customers. So it illustrates a potentially huge impact on an organization's bottom line or patient-related outcomes for healthcare organizations. And that's just from incivility, let alone, frank toxicity. Then there's the effect on the team members, and they could well be the victims of bullying, for example, and the mental harm that can arise from bullying in the workplace, including anxiety, depression, substance misuse, and even suicide, are consequences that can affect them. But also, the employee being on the receiving end of that toxicity will affect their commitment to the organization. As I've said, their productivity, the quality of their work. It'll lead to absenteeism. It'll impair the ability of organizations to retain staff, so they have retention issues. And obviously, the individuals themselves, you can't separate work from your family life and your personal life. So you take all that home with you. Let's take the scenario where a junior doctor, trainee doctor, has been on the receiving end of a public bawling out by one of their attendings or consultants, i.e. a medical manager. And, the feelings that junior doctor is having at that time, the anger, the distraction, the misery, the abject misery, honestly, you feel like crying, when you're in that scenario. Mm-hmm. But then they take those feelings with them to their next patient interaction.
Do they ever? Yeah.
And this can, we'll know what that could lead to. At the least, it could lead to a complaint from a patient about, an abrasive attitude or something like that, or the doctor was distracted because obviously they're thinking about what happened to them. But then there could be a patient safety related consequence, some malpractice or negligence or something that could lead to a lawsuit for the organization as well as for the doctor.
So tell me then, I mean, you've really raised some very concerning issues, and this would be the same regardless of what industry we were talking about, but some of these can almost ultimately have life and death consequences.
Absolutely.
So what are a few of the ways that leaders can pivot their approach to their response to these challenges?
So, I mean, just for sort of fairness and equity, let me preface this with comments that, firstly, I know that most leaders are trying to do their best in difficult circumstances, difficult economic circumstances, the pressures on the healthcare system and in other industries. And secondly, that most leaders are not intentionally trying to cause problems for their colleagues.
Right.
However, it costs nothing and takes next to no time at all for people to be courteous, kind, and even compassionate to their team members. We know from workplace-based studies that people would rather have a nice boss than a pay raise. And so that tells us a huge amount, doesn't it? Employees want to feel, yeah. And it's the same with leave as well. They'd rather have more annual leave than a pay raise, So, but from a managers, the management side of things, employees want to feel valued and invested in by their employers, and by extension, that means invested in and valued by their managers and leaders as well. So, I think some simple, free, and time-efficient ways that leaders can achieve the aims of greater happiness at work for their team members are to practice what I call kind leadership, which is really servant leadership, compassionate leadership, inclusive leadership, but within a culture of respect, courtesy, and friendliness, just simple friendliness.
Yeah, it's amazing how far a kind word will go on even the worst day in the world, in the most difficult circumstances.
But the other thing is, companies will definitely be looking out for cheap ways of achieving this, but don't scrimp on investing both financially and time-wise in your employees. I really like that quote by Richard Branson, who said, train people well enough so they can leave, but treat them well enough so they don't want to. And I think that's a really good adage, by which to work by. I'm not naive. I understand that leaders are constrained by systems and in a wider sense, and perhaps indirectly by the economy. But even if the organization-wide culture is toxic, and a kind of a symptom of that, I think, is where organizations don't practice what they preach through their organizational values. So they all have these values, but is it just lip service,
Yeah, we find that in the corporate world as well. I always say, if you have the problem in your organization and you are doing nothing about it, you're basically endorsing it.
Exactly, you're complicit. Yeah. So I think despite what's going on at a system-wide level, that leaders of teams themselves can still create positive microcultures.
Adam, we've tried to cover an enormous amount of ground on a very difficult subject, which really isn't possible in a small video like this. What's your key message for everyone who sees this video?
But I would love it if organizations started admitting that they have problems with toxic leadership and embrace the paradigm that it's much better for everyone in their company or institution, including their clients or patients and their shareholders, if they became open to initiating a kindness in leadership program. So I, for one, would much rather work for an organization that declared their problems before I started working for them, over one that claimed everything was rosy in the institution, when in actual fact, I found out there was a toxic culture after I'd started working there.
Yeah, what's that old expression, physician, heal thyself?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today. I think this has been a very valuable discussion. You've been watching The Ozone. Join us again soon.